Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lit Chick on a Mighty Blaze. I'm Jenna Paone, and I am so thrilled to welcome back the fabulous Fiona Davis. We are huge fans of you here on a Mighty Blaze and Lit Chick especially, and we're so thrilled that you could join us today. Welcome, Fiona.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be back. It's
so
wonderful to see you.
It's funny, like I feel like we had, we were talking about the Lions of Fifth Avenue be at the beginning of the pandemic, and now it feels like we've gone through hopefully the worst of it and we're coming out the other side, and we have a great new book from you, The Magnolia Palace, which just feels so wonderful to read right now in the spring with all the trees blossoming and sort of life returning. I had so much fun reading this book, and I can't wait to talk about it with you. Before we get into it, real quick, I'm just going to give everyone a little bit of background info on you and a little praise for the book, and then we'll dive right in. New York Times bestselling author Fiona Davis has spent the better part of a decade mining hidden histories of iconic New York City buildings, skillfully using each setting to illuminate the experiences of women and asking questions about how women's voices have changed over time, how cities have changed, and how the arts have impacted lives. She's done so to great effect as a nationally bestselling, critically acclaimed library and bookseller darling with a massive and devoted following. With 2020's The Lions of Fifth Avenue set at the New York Public Library, Davis was launched further into the literary spotlight as a Good Morning America book club pick and New York Times bestseller. Now, Fiona Davis returns with The Magnolia Palace, a tantalizing historical novel about the secrets, betrayal, and murder within the Frick Mansion, one of New York City's most impressive Gilded Age monuments. The Magnolia Palace is an instant New York Times bestseller, an Apple Books Best Book for January 2020, a Library Reads Hall of Fame pick for January, and a She Reads pick for Best Historical Fiction of 2020. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly says the colliding narratives and comprehensive descriptions of the historic mansion make for Davis's best work to date. Library Journal, in yet another starred review, says this is historical fiction at its best, with well-developed characters, detail, art history, and mystery. And Town & Country says Fiona Davis has deployed an unmatched skill for unspooling compelling dramas amidst some of New York's most glittering historic monuments. Fiona, welcome and congratulations on The Magnolia Palace. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. That was the most dynamic introduction I've ever had. I love that.
I feel like I'm a little rusty. I mean, we've been off the Lit Chick game for a little while. I'm like tripping over my words, but we're going to get into it today.
No, you rocked it.
You're awesome. I mean, I remember reading the first book of yours that came out. I remember reading it, and I feel like I've read it was The Dollhouse, right? And I remember reading that. I was living in LA at the time, and I was like, this woman is my jam. Like, she has taken this super cool setting and interwoven this wonderful, narrative. I love the dual timelines that you always do, and strong women doing cool things. Like, it's always a pleasure to read. Your books are always wonderful. And The Magnolia Palace, I really think, is possibly your best yet, even though I might say that every time. It's so cool. I love the Frick collection. It is beloved by my entire family. I've been there many times. It's one of the best museums in New York. Can you tell us a little more about the Magnolia Palace and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. So the Magnolia Palace is set at the Frick, as you mentioned, and the Frick is this gem of a museum in New York. It's not like the Guggenheim or the Met. It's small. It was the residence of Henry Clay Frick and his family. It was his wife and his adult daughter lived there. And they moved in 1914, sorry. And, it's really well preserved. So when you walk in, you see all these paintings because he was this huge art collector. And you have all the furnishings and the rugs and the ceramics. And it really feels like the Frick family just went off to a dinner party, and they'll be back, at any moment. And so I think that's why, especially New Yorkers, just love it. It tends to be people's favorite museum.
There's nothing I love more than a museum in a historic home. And that goes for like homes that are museums, like the Newport Mansions, or things like the Frick collection, or here in Boston, the Gardner Museum. Anytime I go somewhere new, I literally just search for historic mansion museum, and I always hit them up. It's like there's nothing better to me, because you're surrounded by history, you're surrounded by art, and you get a sense of the people. So easy to see why you were inspired by this place. And I understand a particular trip to the Frick inspired your thought process on this novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I was able to get this behind the scenes tour, which was great. And this was in January of 2020. And they took me all over. So we went down and right before. Right before. And we went way down in the basement where there's, that's where the kitchen used to be. And that's where this bowling alley is that still exists, that still works, that was put in 1914. Beautiful. And we just got this amazing tour of, the rooms upstairs where the maid slept and where the fur vault is and the trunk storage room. And so I was able to really start to understand, the spatially, how the family used the house. And because I like dual timeline, I can then compare it to what it's like after it was left, to the public and became a museum.
Right.
And so I thought, this is really perfect for a dual timeline novel. And my next thought was, okay, I need to, look into the Frick family and learn all about them. And boy, did I go down a rabbit hole there, which was really well.
Absolutely. You can tell. So like you said, the novel is dual timelines. It takes place partially in 1919 when the Frick family is still living in the mansion. And it revolves around an artist's model who is also, I think the weaving of the artist model story and inspiration with the Frick family is so great. And I want to talk about that a little more in depth. And then we also go to the 1960s and we have a model, like a Vogue model, who's on a job and ends up being locked in the Frick mansion overnight, which is everyone's mixed up files of Mrs. Basil Frankweiler's like best dream of being locked in the museum overnight. And she sort of uncovers the past and this mystery that happened in 1919. There's a particular part of the mansion, a statue that inspired your character Lillian, who is the artist model. Can you tell us a little more about that and why you chose to tell her this story of the Fricks through her eyes?
Yeah, sure. So as I was leaving that tour, I remember looking back at the doorway, and above it, there's this woman carved in stone in the pediment, kind of above the doorway. And I did some research and learned that her name was Audrey Munson. And Audrey Munson was the top supermodel of the 1900s, the early 1900s. And she was stunning. She had, long dark hair, this aquiline nose, a really small chin. She had narrow shoulders, but curvy hips, which was all the rage. She was very well known for the dimples on her lower back. That's what she was really famous for. And she posed nude for all of these sculptors because she was their favorite.
Yep.
And she had a great career. And then there was this scandal that happened where her landlord killed his wife. Mm-hmm. And the police, when they were investigating, found a black and white photo of Audrey Munson in a bathing suit from when she'd done an ad. And they decided it was a love triangle, and they started hounding her. And that's kind of incorporated into the early part of my book. Yep. Then my story diverges from hers. The true Audrey Munson, she and her mother moved upstate to get away from it. She tried to get into silent films. That did not go well. She tried to die by suicide by drinking mercury. Mm-hmm. And then finally, she was put in an asylum where she died in 1996 at the age of 104.
Which is insane that she lived in the asylum that long. I mean,
that long. And at that time, she was buried in an unmarked grave. She was basically lost to history. Yeah. And I just started thinking, here's this woman who her statue is all over New York. She's at Columbus Circle. She's in front of the Plaza Hotel. She's at the Brooklyn Museum, in front of the library. She's everywhere. And so you walk past her every day, but no one knows who she is. Mm-hmm. And yet we know all the sculptors' names, right? They're well known and all over. And I just started thinking, this is a great story, and she's connected to the mansion, but how can I bring her to life? So I created this character named Lillian, and she starts off by this terrible scandal. She's this big artist muse, and she gets mistaken as an applicant for the private secretary to Helen Frick, who was the very prickly daughter of Henry Frick. Yep. And she gets the job, and she uses it as a way to go incognito and kind of keep away from the scandal. Yep. And so she's working with the family and get caught up in all the family drama. And there's a missing pink diamond known as the Magnolia Diamond. And yeah, chaos ensues. And so her story is different from Audrey Munson's. And I explain very clearly in the author's note what's real and what's not. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole with me, you can.
Yeah. And I want to talk in a little bit about how you pick and choose which parts of the real world to incorporate versus where you fictionalize and where you take some artist license. But before we do, so then the next part of your book takes place in the 1960s, as I said, with a model. What made you choose the 60s? Was it so that, people could be alive and you could have some resolution? Or was there something beyond that kind of drove you? What fascinates you about that time period, and why was that the right period to pick?
Yeah, it's funny because I write dual timeline. I've written a lot of decades from the 1880s to the 1990s, to modern times actually, and I hadn't done the 60s before.
Yeah, cool.
And I started thinking, that could be interesting. And in 2000, of course, there was so much racial turmoil and unrest in America. There was so much reckoning and so many things going on. And that was true of the 60s as well.
Yes.
And I thought it would be a way to kind of explore what's missing on the Frick's walls, which are, painters of color and more diverse artwork. And so there's a character who kind of brings that into the story in a very strong way. Yeah. And so, so I trapped this poor model she's not a very good model. She has a tough time of it. Poor Veronica. And she gets trapped in the mansion for 3 days with this intern named Joshua. And together they stumble upon these hidden clues that are tucked within the artwork of the Frick. And that leaves them on a scavenger hunt that she hopes might solve all of her financial problems. And so those two stories, they're able to entwine because they're close enough. They're only really 50 years apart. That we can join them together in a way that hopefully takes the reader on a really fun ride.
Right, which you often, you almost always do, I think, and you're not like eventually the timelines find each other, which I find very satisfying, because you get answers to all of your questions that you have throughout the book, and there's a great sense of resolution. One thing that I noticed about this book, you mentioned it briefly, that in 2020, while you were writing this, we were going through so many things, the pandemic and a ton of social unrest, which we're still going through, rightfully so. And, it seems like you've done something very clever. Like, we're in this weird space of like, do you talk about the pandemic? Do you not? Is your book, can you talk about this time period right now without any mention of the pandemic? Or how is your book a pandemic novel? You seem to have found a really clever way of weaving what we were experiencing into this historical like the timelines are perfect. They line up because you have the Spanish flu, which is a huge factor in Lillian's story and in the 1919 storyline in general. There was a New York Times article, I think today or yesterday, about how the Spanish flu sort of disappeared from art and from fiction, and it's sort of lost to history, where we have so many books about about World War I and World War II. Wars, figure heavily in art, but not so much things like pandemics. What was it like to write about a pandemic while experiencing a pandemic? Was it cathartic or was it stressful? Was this your way of working through things?
Yeah, no, it touches only in a little part in the beginning of the story when early on, Lillian's mom has passed away from the Spanish flu. Yeah. And it was just the timing. A lot happened in the Frick family in 1919. So I knew I wanted to set it then. And you really couldn't mention that year without mentioning the Spanish flu, because that was the second wave. And so I thought, okay, I can, touch upon it here. Yeah. And then what was interesting was I wrote this whole timeline in the 60s. And I kind of decided to give myself a challenge, because I'd written dual timelines so much at this point that I wanted to keep it to a single location, a limited number of characters, and a limited time period. So we have Veronica and Joshua, and they are trapped in the Frick over. Oops, is that me? Oh, no worries. They're trapped at the Frick over 3 days, right? And I realized only later did I realize, oh, that was me quarantining them.
Yes. Right? Oh, Fiona with the deep interpretation and the deep read. Look at you. Yeah.
An interviewer pointed it out, and I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. But I hadn't consciously done that.
Yeah.
And so that kind of was how all that got incorporated, but not in a very overt way. I think you have to be pretty careful.
Yeah, I love it. And there's also an element of like the Agatha Christie, like sort of country house mystery where, everybody's sort of trapped in, and it's like who done it? Nobody can get in, nobody can get out. And so you're working with the cast of characters and you're constantly like, wait, but was it this person? Was it, you have reason to suspect, because there's a great deal of mystery in this book. I don't want to spoil anything. But I do want to kind of talk about the mystery a little bit. So there is a literal treasure hunt, which is my favorite thing in a book. And I'm so in awe of people that can kind of seamlessly craft these mysteries and these treasure hunt things, because I think it's the hardest thing to do. It is so difficult. I'm writing a book where there's an element of mystery, and the hardest thing for me is to figure out how people find things and what they find and how to, give enough information without too much. And that is so difficult. How do you go about crafting mysteries? And has it gotten easier over time? Let's talk about the mechanics of like the mystery. How do you start? Do you start with like, the end game, and so you work your way backwards, or do you start and like sort of, weave your way into it?
It's so hard. And especially you have a mystery in 2 timelines. So you have to make them both work. And that can
like
be
5 mysteries.
Yeah. It's so painful. And so I know the ending. I tend to know the ending. And then what I do is I work backwards from there. And usually with the first drafts, the mystery and the clues are very, they're too subtle. And then I'll have someone read it and they'll be like, what? And I realize, I'm trying so hard to keep it a mystery that I'm actually sublimating all the clues so that they're non-existent. And so then I have to usually go in and bump them up and hope that I'm not giving away too much. So it's tricky. It's a tricky dance.
And one thing I love about this particular mystery, I love a stolen item. Like I love stolen art. I love a heist, right? Everybody loves a heist. Everybody loves a missing thing, especially a pink diamond. In this case, you have a fictional object called the Magnolia Diamond, which didn't really exist, but could have existed. Can you talk a little bit about how you came up with the concept of the Magnolia Diamond, and why you decided to kind of center that in all of this?
Yeah, I needed something that could be hidden away. Something that could be tucked away at the frick somewhere to eventually possibly be found. And so at first it was just a diamond. And then we were trying to figure out the title, and the title for me always comes at the very end.
Interesting.
It's really hard because you need something that applies to the building and the plot.
Yes.
So I was thinking, okay, it's a palace and there's these 3 beautiful magnolia trees right out front. And so I put together Magnolia Palace and thought, okay, that's a great title. And luckily everybody else thought so. And then I decided, I can make the diamond a pink diamond and call it the Magnolia Diamond. And there we go. So it usually is a little retrofitting once I get the title. So for example, in the lines of Fifth Avenue, once we decided on that as the title, I changed the family's name in the book. Library to the Lyons, Lyons.
Yes.
And again, that way we get both things working.
Yep. So same kind of thing. You went back and added those magnolia details, and because that's, the imagery, especially right now, this is such a great springtime read with all the trees blossoming and things. Like I am wearing my magnolia, or I think it's cherry blossom, but it's as close as I could get, blouse, because, I love this time of year. It's so beautiful, and it makes, it's all the pink and the blushing, kind of imagery. It's when you sort of it's when I feel my most girly, I think, is this time of year. And that just really, it's one of those things that it's like synchronicity when you read it and you're looking around and you're like, it's like, reading an Ellen Hildebrand book when you go to Nantucket, you're just like, I'm living this, the beautiful trees are all around me. And it's a perfect book to go take into the park and read on a warm, Saturday or Sunday afternoon.
Yes, as the cherry blossoms fall on you, Yeah. In fact, they did such a great job with the cover, with the way they, put the magnolias around it. I thought that was so brilliant of the art department.
And your covers are always so striking. Is it the same? Obviously, it's the art department, but is it the same artist who kind of does them every time, or do you work with them What's that process usually like?
Yeah, the art department is headed by a guy named Christopher Lynn, and he's just great. And he tends to come up with the concept. I'll send photographs of the building that, if they need to incorporate them,
Mhm.
so they can have some options for that. And then they really put it together, and it's been such a fun experience. And there's a lot of details that have to be worked out. But the minute I saw this cover with the magnolias, I thought, yeah, this is absolutely going to work. I thought that was such a nice kind of fresh touch to a historical fiction novel.
Oh, so beautiful. And we're getting some great questions from the audience today, actually. So I'm going to get to those in a little bit. Just wanted to let everybody know, like, keep them coming. We are going to get to some. But first, I'm just going to go back and do a couple of the nuts and bolts sort of things. Does the book always start with a landmark for you, or do you sometimes start with the character? Like, or it seems like you always start with the place. Place seems very important to you.
All of the books except one have started with the place. And what I do is I pick a place tentatively and then start doing research. And usually something jumps out at me that's just a huge surprise. And for this book, it was Audrey Munson. It was Helen Frick. These really interesting women who existed back then, who were completely different from each other. And it just started me wondering, what if they met? What if they connected? And so that's where that came from. And then, but the one book that wasn't was The Chelsea Girls. That started with an actress who was in her 90s who I met and was talking about the McCarthy era in New York theater. And so then I kind of thought, oh, what would work with that? And the Chelsea Hotel was this hotbed of political and artistic craziness. And so that worked out well there. But yeah, the thing is, there's so many great buildings in New York with these layers of history. And you just scratch the surface and you find something fascinating to write about, like a family that lives in the library or an art school in Grand Central. And that's what's fun, is I'm going on a ride just as the reader is. I'm learning all these new things, and to put it together into a fictional plot is really fun.
Yeah. And what I love is that not only do you do this, but you do it through the eyes of women. Obviously, you're a female writer, and you center women's voices in your stories, and you center women in historical periods where women were not centered, which I think is so important. What is it? Why is it important for you to, tell about these landmarks that many people, these landmarks are universally recognized, and these time periods are universally recognized, but our sense of history is often through a different lens. So what does it mean to you to kind of re-represent history in this way?
Yeah, it's something like you looking at the Frick family, and you had Henry Clay Frick, who was this industrialist who was a really ruthless man and had a lot of attention showered on him and made a lot of money. And then you had his wife, Adelaide, who really retired from view after a terrible tragedy that happened within the family. And then you have the daughter, Helen, who never married, never had kids, but went on to do some really incredible things, like founding this Frick Art Reference Library, which is one of the top in the world. And, she was on the board for a long time. She was really interesting, but she was also really complicated. There was a New Yorker profile of her from the 1930s that described her as a woman of extremely robust prejudices, which is putting it nicely.
Yikes.
Right? And so she was someone who did not get that much attention. She was on the sidelines. She was in the shadow of her father.
Yes.
And so finding these women's stories and shining a light on them, like Audrey Munson or Helen Frick, it's just a different way of looking at that era. And what these women were going through, and what it was like to have your whole life just be kind of a prism of others' wants and needs. You're with everybody else.
And another thing I love is how you represent, you work through sort of things that we're thinking about consciously in the modern era, in these historical eras. So you work through the idea of professional ambition versus family obligation, or women's traditional roles, and what happens if you don't fit into that traditional role. How do you balance the need to portray historical women in a different time period that's very different from our own, with writing for a modern audience? How do you kind of approach that? Because I think you do it very well. I think you strike a good balance.
Thank you. I think it's finding the things where we intersect, and also finding the things that are slightly horrifying. Like the fact that, a woman couldn't open her own bank account until the 70s or get a credit card without a mail approval. It sounds like we're in Saudi Arabia, right?
Right.
But that was the 1970s.
Right.
And so I think it's also a reminder of how far we've come. Of so that as your reader, you see these obstacles that these women are facing in terms of just going out and being financially independent, or, you know, finding their way in the world. And without a man, it was really frightening, unless you had a lot of money like Helen Frick.
Right.
But you could not.
For her, it was difficult, right? I mean, like, even for her, who was basically her father's heiress, like, to, you know, she clearly had a lot of problems. Again, I don't want to ruin anything. Like, there's part of that, you know, but she faced a lot of challenges herself. And you have to wonder whether the negative perception of her is due to what she was really like, or whether she just wasn't the type of woman that the time period accepted.
You put it exactly. That's exactly right. You know, was she a girl boss, or was she, you know, this nasty, you know, prickly woman? And what I find is that there's an intersection there of a woman who's complicated and three-dimensional. Yeah.
And I also appreciate that you don't shy away from also making these women real and giving them deep flaws. And, you know, it's not like nobody is Lillian White, you know, like nobody is fully, you know, free of wrongdoing. Not necessarily, you know, they're not saints, they're not devils, but we have and I think people have always been like that. And we're just only kind of now talking about it more in depth. Another thing I think you balance really well in all of your books is, you know, your books contain really big depths of sorrow and heartache and loss and tragedy. And there's also a lot of suspense and mystery, and there's a lot of danger. However, they're also very elegant and comforting and pleasurable to read in a way that, say, for me as a reader, you know, a really like certain type of, you know, murder mystery wouldn't be relaxing to me. But like this book, you know, you present these big, you know, dark kind of topics in a really lovely, gilded way. And I'm curious how you approach that as a writer of balancing that, and whether that's intentional or just, you know, what you look for yourself in books.
Yeah, I think, you know, I love the aspect of time travel, of being in another age where things were so different, and being able to point out, you know, how you got across town in the 1800s or the 1920s and what people wore. I love what they ate. You know, I love those kind of luxurious pleasures that are just part of being alive. And so it's fun to bring them into the book so that there's a celebration of, you know, the arts, or, you know, what someone's wearing or what their hair is like. And I just love exploring that, because to me, that's like, you know, traveling back to 1919 and seeing what it was like. And to bring that alive and make you feel like you're really there is, I think, the fun of writing historical fiction.
Absolutely. I mean, getting swept up in it. Obviously, I don't know, I'm sure you've watched The Gilded Age. I have. And, you know, for anyone who has just finished it, like, this is a great book to read, even though it's slightly later than The Gilded Age, which is perfect because it's kind of like that continuation. It's such an interesting time in American history, and I'm so glad we're getting more and more books and films and TV shows about it, because it's such a rich time period to draw from. Let's talk about that research a little bit. I'm going to take a question from the audience, from Sharon, who says, in your research, did you spend a lot of time researching one thing that you ended up not even using in the book? And so I'm going to expand that a little bit after, but let's do that first. Was there anything that you couldn't include?
That is you know, the Fricks, their lives later on, and their early lives before they came to New York were full of things that were happening. I mean, the biography that was written, one of their descendants has written biographies of both Helen and Henry, and there was so much there that happened when she was a child, and when Henry was young, and later on. And I just couldn't do it. I had to keep it to 1919 because otherwise it would just be too expansive. Yeah, and so that felt like there were certain things there that just couldn't work. For example, the Fricks had a son who died as an infant. And I had to kind of cut him out, unfortunately, because there was just so much. There was already another child, a sister who died. And that was kind of the crux of the book. And I needed to focus on that. So that was tricky, but I highly recommend reading those other biographies, because it's a fascinating family. It's talk about a wild ride.
Yes. The and I want to point out to Anissa, one of our other viewers, also basically kind of asked that similar question of, was there anything you wanted to include? So clearly people are interested in your research of the Frick family. Can you tell us about a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of that research? So once you were in the building and clearly inspired by it, were you able to go back at all? I mean, this was in the height of COVID. Were you able to go in, or was this all from memory? Were you like online going through virtual tours? Like, how did you go about doing that in a time where I assume normally you would make several trips and, do that? So what was that process like of doing this?
Yeah, it was crazy, because we locked down in March. And at that point, the Frick closed down. And at that point, they went under renovation. So they are closed right now. Most of the artwork is at the Frick Madison, which is just down the street. And you can still see the exterior of the building, but that'll be opening up sometime next year, which should be amazing. And so I was really stuck, but I have to say, just go to frick.org, because they have on there, you can see a floor plan of the public spaces, and you can go into any room and get a 360-degree view. And so that's what I would do. I'd think, okay, this scene is set in the library. Let me jump in there and see what it looks like.
Yeah.
And I'd go in, take a look. All right, there's that painting. There's that, here's a desk. And then I could use it that way. And they also had wonderful old photos of the rooms that are now offices and what they were like as bedrooms. They had things like the list of the 27 staff who served the 3 members of the Frick family, which is quite a ratio. So you could see who worked there, what their nationality was, how much they were paid, what their job was. It was so much. It was really great. They even have menus from dinner parties.
Love that.
So I could take that and work that into the story as well. So I was able to get a really good, solid idea of what that house was like as a working mansion.
I love that. Yeah, because that's the thing, is they were job places. I mean, that's a large number of employees to have. And it's interesting because the economy at the time, like that was a big part of the economy, was this idea of family institutions and people in service. And it's a real interesting thing to write about. There's always that upstairs downstairs thing, the life of, and Lillian is an interesting character because she straddles that line, because she is an employee, but she is a vaulted employee in the same way that, on the Gilded Age, right? We have the private secretary, and, there's an element of respect that's afforded to Lillian in the same way. And I love, you draw this parallel of like the interest in being an archivist and being a woman of history, and, as an occupation that, you have to wonder if women who were private secretaries then would have been well suited for jobs like that. I think you do a really good job of translating that into like, what does that look like in the future? Similarly, on a broader level, how do you go about choosing this is a good thing to keep in the book, or this is not going to work? And just how do you kind of approach that? Because you write historical fiction that is also grounded in real people and real places and reality. You're not taking you're not just choosing a year and doing a whole, story just completely fictionalized. You're really going to, you're drawing from real history. So how do you approach that as a writer, when to take artistic license and when to stick to the truth?
Yeah. I as I'm researching, I'm counting on my spidey sense, like something makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And that's when okay, I should go down this road, and I might want to include that. And so with this, it was learning about Audrey Munson and realizing, well, that could be incorporated into it. It was, choosing 1919 as a year because so much was going on in the family at that point. It was just casting a really wide net, and you're doing this in a panic because you can imagine, how am I going to create a story? Can I pull this off again?
No.
Right. And so it's a matter of pulling in as much. And then eventually I start getting ideas for scenes and characters.
Mhm.
And I hit a tipping point.
Mm.
That's when I know, okay, I need to start outlining and consider starting a draft. But the research takes about 3 to 4 months to really get through enough and feel like I have a sense of not
Yeah.
only the mansion and the people, but also the time period.
And you do that first. So you do your research period, like let's go nuts and bolts into your writing. And then you start sketching out an outline and characters. And that's sort of your process. So then what's the next step? Do you write sequentially, or like, do you write a rough draft sequentially, or do you, kind of make more notes or go back to the books, and like what's sort of, and what's kind of I guess the general timeline for it? Because you're obviously now you're on contract, like you have deadlines, and you're on now many books later, right? It's not like some of us over here taking like 4 or 5 years to write our first novel, which I think is very typical of first time writers. It takes you a long time, and then you kind of learn how to write on deadline and learn how to, you learn the mechanisms of the format. And so what's your process like?
Yeah. My first book took, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. That first one is it deserves all that time because you're learning so much.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's about 1.5 years.
Cool.
And after I've done all that research, what I do is I do an outline, and I figure out what each timeline needs to do, and then braid them together.
Yep.
And then to write, I do a really fast first draft where I do just the older timeline first, and then I do the modern timeline. And then it's putting them together, making sure they work, and doing about 10 different drafts of the novel until it's finally ready to hit my editor's desk. So it's a long process, and it tends to be a lot of layering on as opposed to overwriting and peeling away.
Cool. So you're more of a bare bones and then add things, and that's cool to know. I'm the opposite. I'm a total overwriter, and I wish I was not. I feel like I would much rather come up with the bones of it and then add. And I'm just like not. I am like, here is the entire history of every person and their cousin and their, and here's what this looks like, and here's what the thing is like, and everyone's like, nobody cares. Just get us to see it. Which I think you do really well, especially, I always notice about your books that like within like 2 pages, we are like into a big problem, and we're in a high stakes situation, and we know we're going to get, from A to B. Like, I think it's very well constructed from a plot, standpoint. Was that something you had to work on, or does that kind of come naturally to you? I know your background, just like mine, is in acting and theater and film, and I wonder if that influenced you at all. Like, how did you get to the point of like, okay, I know how to tightly plot something?
Yeah, I read a lot of books on plotting, and I kind of looked at books that I loved and figured out what they did structure wise. But I definitely think having an acting background helps, because if you've been in a bad play, you know how
haven't we all?
You know how painful it is when a scene goes on too long or the dialogue's not good. And so maybe that gives us a little bit of an edge. But it was really educating myself as to how to get into a story fast, how to create that hook, how important those early pages are, and then how to leave the reader guessing. Because with a dual timeline, you're asking them to go on a really long haul. And you're asking them to start on one thing and then jump to another and then jump back. And so how to leave each section so that the reader's really ready to go back.
Which you do so well. I mean, every chapter is a giant cliffhanger that makes me want to skip going and go back. Like, but it's so great. It really, like, I think you're so excellent at that, of the, it's almost like you can see like, okay, and this is the thing. And then we're immediately going to go back and solve that. But then we're going to have 15 different problems that arise, and then we're going to reach a new climax. I mean, it's a little novel in every chapter, which is, I think, from a plot standpoint, what you're always going for as a writer. That's what keeps people turning the pages. That's what makes your books compulsively readable. And I think you do that so well. Speaking of the dual timelines, I'm going to do a question from one of our viewers, Margaret. Was there a moment when you decided that you were going to make all of your books dual timeline because you loved it so much? Or did that just, obviously that happened naturally in your first one, and did you just decide you were going to do it again?
That's a great question. I started the first book that way because I like reading them. And if I'd known how hard it is to do them, I would have never done it. It was just being ignorant. about how tough that is.
Yeah.
But it worked out. That book got a lot of attention and worked out well. And so when I was looking at the next book, which was set at the Dakota, I just couldn't help but do the same thing because, again, the building's so different, 1880s to 1980s. Yeah. And I really wanted to capture both of those eras because they're so different, yet in many ways comparable. Yep. And so, yeah, and then it was the publisher saying, hey, we like this. We want a building and dual timelines. That seems to be working. Although the Chelsea Girls is a little different in terms of the setup. And the book I'm working on now is a little more of bookended by modern times, but a long ride in the 1950s.
Can you tell us a little more about that book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So as I was trying to figure out what to do next, I got an email from a reader in South Carolina, and she said she was a former Rockette. And she said, if I wanted to know any secrets about Radio City, I should call her. And so I did. And we had this great conversation. I've been doing lots of research and writing and talking to Rockettes in their 70s and 80s, which has been a treat. So that'll be out sometime next year.
Oh, I mean, as a former dancer, like I am all over a Rockette book. Fun story. I actually wrote and pitched a Hallmark script at one point that is a modern version. It's the Jingle Bells instead of the Rockettes, but it's about a Rockette who of course goes back to her small town and tries to, save her small town because that's what.
Perfect. I love it.
I love a radio. I'm so excited for a Radio City book. And would that come out at Christmas, or would that be
I guess it'll be maybe fall.
Yeah.
The publisher, but I think they would want to time it around that. So we'll see.
Nice. I actually have a few acquaintances that are Rockettes currently. That it's intense. My cousin auditioned to be a Rockette and was just a centimeter too short. They have to be exactly the same size, height, everything.
Oh yeah.
But it's a crazy thing. I love that. I love how you tackle all of these New York institutions. My favorite New York institutions and this is a fun exercise because I think you'll probably continue writing about New York. But if you were to venture into another city and what would it be and why? Or what would that be?
I think I would love to set a book in London. I think that would be great because you're talking, in America, you're talking about history, you maybe go 100, 150 years back.
Yep.
In London, you could jump back to, Shakespeare's times and do something on there. So that would be great. That would be it would be worth the trip.
I think all of your readers, certainly myself, would be totally willing to, depart from New York for a brief spell in order to have a London book, or maybe you can work London into, something. Maybe we can do a Globe Theater in London and, somebody I'm just spitballing here.
I like
this. It happen. I'm all for it. Let's get Fiona's next book. Crowdsourcing your next book. Before we go, if anybody has, another question, feel free to pop it in the chat. But I also just want to talk to you a little bit about your love of history. Were you always interested in, I've always loved historical fiction. I've always been drawn to books, Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, which of course were not written as historical things, but now are in the past. Were you always sort of a student of history, or is that something that developed later on in your life? And if so, what was maybe the thing that kind of said to you, I want to write historical fiction? I'm always interested in hearing about that moment, because I feel like as artists and writers, we all try things and we're well, I could do this, or I could do this, and I could do this. And we go down a million paths and we have many, many careers. And then you hit that point where you do the thing and it clicks. And I would love to know what that moment was for you when you decided.
Such a good question. I always loved the Laura Ingalls Wilder books as a kid. I read them and reread them and had the entire collection.
Yep.
Oh, they're so good. And for me, it wasn't until I was kind of in my mid 40s and I was looking for an apartment in New York, and I learned about the Barbizon Hotel, which at that point was a condo. And it was the tipping point was reading about the Barbizon and these women, all the Ford models who lived there. And, the Katie Gibbs secretarial school girls. And so it was a matter of thinking, wow, what a time that must have been, and what would it have been like? And also loving the fashions, the 50s outfits. And I think that's what sucked me in,
Yep,
was
absolutely.
really the Barbizon Hotel and the residence.
Fashion and food, like that's when I think about like all my favorite books. I like really wanted to know what Laura Ingalls Wilder was wearing. Like I wanted to hear about the muff, like the fur muff, and like Ma's like Deline dress. Like was that it? Like with the blackberry buttons, and like I like vividly remember these things, and what they ate, and I want to know what people ate and what they wore. Like that's mostly what I want to know. And I this is why I like to read historical fiction, because there's so much, what we ate and what we wore, and that's what we're interested in, right? Like
That's it.
I love it.
Blackberry buttons. I can't believe you remember that. That's
so
good.
Oh yeah, I read those books. I mean, they're literally I still have them, and they're falling apart. And I'm like, I should throw these out. I have new copies. Like I should, but I like can't part with it. There's literally an elastic band around one of them, and there's no cover. And I'm like, why do I keep this? But I loved those books, and Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, the puff sleeves and everything. Like that's what I want to read about, which is unsurprising why I love your books so much. Fiona, this has been such a pleasure. You are just always such a delight. We always have so much fun when you come on A Mighty Blaze. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We had a great group today. Please check out Fiona's new book, The Magnolia Palace, if you haven't yet. I want to say thank you so much to Julie Gerstenblatt, who is producing behind the scenes, who is an amazing historical fiction author in her own right, and has her first book coming out next spring, which I can't wait. And I'm already like pre-booking her for Lit Chick now. We are so thrilled to have you all today with us on A Mighty Blaze. And thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you. Any parting words, any favorite moments from writing this book, or favorite things about the Frick Museum, or things maybe you hope readers take from this book?
Oh, I would recommend checking out the Frick website, and coming up, they paired me with one of the curators, and we had a long conversation about the art and the family, and that will be coming up in early May. It'll be all over social media, so keep an eye out. It's for me, it's a huge thanks to the Frick for being such an amazing partner during this process. It's been so much fun.
I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much for joining us again, Fiona. Congratulations on the Magnolia Palace. And thank you all for being with us. We will see you again next week. And actually, our esteemed producer, Julie Gerstenblatt, is going to be interviewing next week. And I'm so thrilled for her to take the spotlight then. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day today. And thanks for joining us on Lunch.